Please turn with me to 2 Chronicles chapter 23. During the reign of Joash, the third period of revival came to the southern kingdom of Judah. Of course, it was not much of a revival, and most of the credit for a return to God belongs to the priest Jehoiada. The leadership of Judah was dissatisfied with the queen Athaliah. So now Jehoiada, the priest, calls them to a meeting, a very private meeting, to let them know that there is a son of David who is still alive. If you would recall, Jehoiada's wife had saved Joash during the time Queen Athaliah was trying to kill all her own offspring. Now listen to what they do. They all pledge themselves to make this little boy in the line of David king over them. They gathered Levites and the chiefs of Israel and laid careful plans to crown little Joash, who was in the line of David. A third part of the group would act as porters at the door of the temple on the Sabbath. Then a third part would be at the king's house, and a third part would be at the gate of the foundation. They would not permit anyone inside the temple except the priests and the Levites. The Levites around the little king would all be armed with weapons. Jehoiada gave out spears and bucklers and shields, which were kept in the temple. All of these arrangements were carried out. Look at verse 11 of chapter 23. Jehoiada and his sons brought out the king's son and put the crown on him. They presented him with a copy of the covenant and proclaimed him king. They anointed him and shouted, "Long live the king." This was an exciting and thrilling coup. The little 7-year-old Joash, who is in the line of David, is now on the throne of Judah. Take note that Jehoiada and his sons crowned Joash the king. I just wanted you to note that because a little later on, towards the end of his life, Joash actually kills one of the sons of Jehoiada. We'll come to that a little later. But I want you to just note that Jehoiada's sons were involved in making sure that Joash is crowned king. Athaliah thought that she had killed off all the offspring. Why had she done such a brutal act? She had a thirst for power. She wanted to be queen, and of course the evil one was working behind the scenes, trying to cut off the line of David. There are certain men and certain women in this world who will do anything for power. Well, isn't that a problem with all of us? We'll stoop to almost anything in order to have power. Just like this queen, she craved for power. Listen to verse 12. When Athaliah heard the noise of the people running and cheering the king, she went to them at the temple of the Lord. Verse 13, she looked, and there was the king standing by his pillar at the entrance. The officers and the trumpeters were beside the king, and all the people of the land were rejoicing and blowing trumpets, and singers with musical instruments were leading the praises. Then Athaliah tore her robes and shouted, "Treason! Treason!" Athaliah was certainly taken by surprise. From her standpoint, it was high treason. Then Jehoiada, in verse 14, listen to what he does. Verse 14 says, Jehoiada the priest sent out the commanders of units of 100 who were in charge of the troops and said to them, "Bring her out between the ranks and put to the sword anyone who follows her." For the priests had said, "Do not put her to death at the temple of the Lord." So they seized her as she reached the entrance of the horse gate on the palace grounds, and there they put her to death. Now Joash is still a young boy, only 7 years of age. So Jehoiada is his regent. Jehoiada is actually the one who will make the decisions until this boy comes of age. Jehoiada is God's priest, and he leads the nation back to the worship of God. Verse 16, Jehoiada then made a covenant that he and the people and the king would be the Lord's people. Jehoiada broke down the altars of Baal and killed the priests of Baal, He revived worship of Jehovah by setting up the order of priests and Levites for the burnt offerings. Singing was restored as it had been ordained by David. Porters watched the gates, so nothing unclean entered the temple. Verse 21. And all the people of the land rejoiced, and the city was quiet because Athaliah had been slain with the sword. There is a repetition over and over. Sin always brings complications, trouble, heartbreak, and the judgment of God. Revival restores peace and quiet to the land. You know, half the problems that we go through is not because of circumstances that are around us. Many times the problems are caused simply because of our own disobedience. If not, it may be the disobedience of somebody else closest to us, and because of that we tend to face the consequences. And now when we think back right to the time of Adam and Eve, it was because of sin that we have problems in this world. We have suffering. Verse 1 of chapter 24. Joash was 7 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 40 years. His mother's name was Zibiah. She was from Beersheba. Jehoiada the priest is the one who really guided and led this little boy during the early part of his reign. However, his mother's name is given to us, and she must have been a good mother. She apparently agreed with the return to the Lord which was taking place. Her home was in Beersheba. Beersheba is also the town of Abraham. Let's read verse 2. Joash did what was right in the eyes of the Lord all the years of Jehoiada the priest. Verse 4. Sometime later, Joash decided to restore the temple of the Lord. Verses 5 and 6. He called together the priests and Levites and said to them, Go to the towns of Judah and collect the money due annually from all Israel to repair the temple of your God. Do it now. But the Levites did not act at once. Verse 6. Therefore the king summoned Jehoiada the priest, the chief priest, and said to him, Why haven't you required the Levites to bring in from Judah and Jerusalem the tax imposed by Moses, the servant of the Lord, and by the assembly of Israel for the tent of the testimony? If you notice, Joash is taking charge of his kingdom. I think all this while Jehoiada was the one giving directions. And if you notice, Joash has matured and is taking charge, and he also calls on Jehoiada and asks him, why isn't it being done? Let's read on. Verse 7. Now the sons of that wicked woman Athaliah had broken into the temple of God and had used even its sacred objects for the Baals. This tells us what had actually happened to the temple and who was responsible. God's temple was in a terribly disreputable condition. So Joash takes the matter in his own hands and he wants to make some changes. 8 to 10. At the king's command, a chest was made and placed outside at the gate of the temple of the Lord. A proclamation was then issued in Judah and Jerusalem that they should bring to the Lord the tax that Moses, the servant of God, had required of Israel in the desert. All the officials and all the people brought their contributions gladly, dropping them into the chest until it was full. The princes and the people rejoiced, cheerfully gave, in order for the work of the Lord to be established. Now verse 11. Whenever the chest was brought in by the Levites to the king's officials, and they saw that there was a large amount of money, the royal secretary and the officer of the chief priest would come and empty the chest and carry it back to its place. They did this regularly and collected a great amount of money. Now let's see what they do with the money. Verses 12 to 13. The king and Jehoiada gave it to the men who carried out the work required for the temple of the Lord. They hired masons and carpenters to restore the Lord's temple, and also workers in iron and bronze to repair the temple. The men in charge of the work were diligent, and the repairs progressed under them. They rebuilt the temple of God according to its original design and reinforced it. As a result, the repair work of the temple was completed. Verse 14. When they had finished, they brought the rest of the money to the king and Jehoiada, and with it were made articles for the Lord's temple, articles for the service and for the burnt offerings. and also dishes and other objects of gold and silver. As long as Jehoiada lived, burnt offerings were presented continually in the temple of the Lord. There were sufficient funds to remake the vessels and implements to carry on the regular services in the temple. Now verse 15 says, Jehoiada was old and full of years, and he died at the age of 130. He was buried with the kings in the city of David because of the good he had done in Israel for God and his temple. Jehoiada actually received royal honors in his death. One of the reasons why we noticed earlier on in the earlier part of this chapter, the reasons why the priests were negligent in carrying out the order of the king would probably be because Jehoiada was pretty old and then Joash was too young. So I guess the priests wouldn't have taken Joash too seriously, or wouldn't have taken Jehoiada seriously either because he was too old. But at the same time, they did make significant changes. Joash, young as he was, with Jehoiada, with all that experience, both of them made a tremendous amount of impact and changes in the temple. But as we see, we note very clearly that Jehoiada's service and faithfulness to God was evident, and it was because of him a lot of the changes were made. As long as he lived, the temple's worship carried on. Now deterioration takes place. Verse 17 and 18. After the death of Jehoiada, the officials of Judah came and paid homage to the king, and he listened to them. Verse 18. They abandoned the temple of the Lord, the God of their fathers, and worshipped Asherah poles and images. Because of their guilt, God's anger came upon Judah and Jerusalem. You see, as long as Jehoiada lived, the top officials did not dare go into any form of false worship. Jehoiada maintained a very strong influence, a good influence on the young King Joash, on probably the young King Joash who didn't have a mind of his own as strong as Jehoiada. He was probably very lenient. These princes pledge allegiance to him and they go about doing their own thing. Verse 19 says, although the Lord sent prophets to the people to bring them back to him, and though they testified against them, they would not listen. God in his mercy sends out prophets to warn them, but they are deaf to the pleas, deaf to their cries. So God sends a message by a man who is the son of Jehoiada. Verse 20. Then the Spirit of God came upon Zechariah, son of Jehoiada the priest. He stood before the people and said, This is what God says. Why do you disobey the Lord's command? You will not prosper because you have forsaken the Lord, he has forsaken you. Now notice the shocking thing that happens. Verse 21. But they plotted against him, and by order of the king they stoned him to death in the courtyard of the Lord's temple. King Joash did not remember the kindness Zechariah's father Jehoiada had shown him, but killed his son, who said as he lay dying, May the Lord see this and call you to account. What a sad thing. Zechariah would have been probably one of the sons standing by alongside his brothers as well as his father Jehoiada when Joash was being crowned king. Zechariah would have seen the immense influence that he had on Joash. Jehoiada played the second fiddle, as it were. Even though he had more power, more knowledge, he chose to allow God's anointed, God's promised son in the line of David to rule. He allowed that. So in that sense, he could have actually taken powers and taken matters in his own hands. Jehoiada could have done that. But Jehoiada followed the ways of the Lord and allowed Joash to rule. And he served him with his advice, with his knowledge, with his experience. Zechariah would have seen the immense sacrifice of Jehoiada. And Zechariah was the one probably who helped Joash to be crowned king. And now when he stands there in the Spirit of God, proclaiming God's truth. Look what happens. Joash turns around and gets him killed. He is put to death. What a sad thing that takes place. Joash does not remember the kindness which Jehoiada, his father, had done to him. If it wasn't for Jehoiada and his wife, Joash wouldn't have had a chance to live. And now what does he do? He kills Jehoiada's son. Joash made significant changes at the beginning of his reign. But then towards the end, what a sad ending. Judgment comes upon Joash. Let's read verses 23 to 24. At the turn of the year, the army of Aram marched against Joash, invaded Judah and Jerusalem, and killed all the leaders of the people. They sent all the plunder to their king in Damascus. Although the Aramean army had come with only a few men, the Lord delivered into their hands a much larger army, because Judah had forsaken the Lord, the God of their fathers. Judgment was executed on Joash. When the Arameans withdrew, this is verse 25, they left Joash severely wounded. His officials conspired against him for murdering the son of Jehoiada the priest, and they killed him in his bed. So he died and was buried in the city of David, but not in the tombs of the kings. There was no honor in the way he died. Jehoiada the priest had been buried with honor. People loved him because he stood for the Lord's word and for the Lord's commands, whereas Joash the king is buried with dishonor. Now, although Joash had been a good king initially, he had ordered this heartless murder. God judges him, and because he is the king and because of his influence upon the whole nation, he is killed. On the other hand, think of Jehoiada, a man who was wise, a man who had age, who had knowledge. I'm just amazed at the way he stood behind Joash, a young boy of 7, and empowered him to rule well. And in spite of all the sacrifice, the grace, and the time that he would have spent with Joash, it didn't turn out good. When Jehoiada died, Joash turned away. And what is more is the fact that Joash killed his son, Zechariah. Dear friend, I hope that each one of us would take stock of our lives. Yes, you need perseverance, you need commitment in order to finish the race.